We're looking at identifying a goal, talking about who you're going to target with whatever action you're going to take, talking about a mechanism of delivering that, and then working to achieve that goal, and you repeat that process over and over again. I mean, these are examples, and again, I'm not going to go through all this, but here are all the targets of political pressure you could think about. The government detaining the prisoner is the obvious first target. The government of the United States, in our case, particularly because of our U.S. location, foreign governments that you might want to get involved, regional governmental bodies, and international agencies. And you can see here the purpose of why you might get all these groups, all these governments involved, and the kinds of officials you might want to engage. The various ways of applying political pressure, this is from a U.S. context. There's everything from letters to briefings, phone calls, resolutions, speeches, hearings, an increasing level of effort required. We do these all the time on all of our cases. The same kind of process also would unfold in the European Parliament or in other domestic parliaments. If you're trying to raise awareness in Aung San Suu Kyi's case, there have been a lot of domestic parliaments that have adopted resolutions calling for her release. It's a nice thing to do. It doesn't really have any legal effect, but it's a nice piece of advocacy that can also lead to more public relations. Again, given our U.S. context, there are a lot of parts of the U.S. government that we go to in order to put pressure on the government that's detaining our client. We look at where the United States and other governments, European Commission and others, give away money in terms of foreign aid. That's obviously a key leverage point with some governments, with others less so. And there are different ways that one thinks about doing these kinds of issues. Again, I'm not going to get into this in a lot of detail. Let me talk about public relations just briefly. That in essence, on all of our cases, you need to be able to kind of summarize in very short order and a couple of talking points or the elevator speech, 30 seconds, why a person is wrongfully detained and why whoever you're talking to should care. And that's in essence what you're doing with public relations. You're looking at, having a media kit that's like a one-page biography and any newspaper articles you've gotten, all right, and you want to then pitch the story to reporters that you think might be interested in that kind of story on the basis of targeting them in the right way to get coverage. As I mentioned, this is examples of the toolkit, the summary of the case, a biography, news articles, letters, all that stuff can be put together and handed to a reporter. The target list is really people who cover the country that are involved, television, radio, print. Print is usually the easiest media to get. When it comes to radio or television, it requires a much more high-profile case in order to get engaged. And then reporters who have covered the country or the kinds of issues involved. And over time, you expand your list to include people who have been writing about that kind of story. And then, you look at timing. I mean, the reason why media will take up a story is, in essence, message, messenger, and timing. What is the message you're trying to achieve, and is it compelling? Who's the one who's delivering that message? And why now? Why should they do a story now? And so, we look for anniversaries of, detention for a year, or, when we file a petition at the UN, or when we, decide to do a public protest for a particular reason. Those are all compelling times. In terms of, as we've just discussed the message some, but messenger, oftentimes we'll have the family members themselves. Lawyers tend to be less compelling advocates than family members. And so oftentimes we'll put the family members out front if they're out of the country. Obviously, we don't want to put their lives in danger, so if they're in the country, the lawyers will do more of the advocacy. And then ultimately, one can't forget when you look to secure the release of somebody, that our work at least is not done until they're safe, whether it be within their own country or abroad. We've had a number of people who have gotten out of very tough situations who have wanted to leave the country that they were detained in, and we've helped facilitate their exit and their entry into other countries. And you can see here, again, some of what that work entails. Let me just quickly go through here and then open it up for questions, because we've gone through a lot of material very quickly. But let me just talk about a case study of an actual case of a client we worked on. We represented a Pakistani Christian who was arrested in 1996 and accused of blasphemy. The accusation was that he had told his neighbor that Christianity was correct and that the neighbor should read Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses. Afterwards, the person who made that complaint against him ended up moving into his house and was given the land by the local government. At the trial 2 years later, the person who actually had accused him of this blasphemy and who was now living in his house actually shot him in the courtroom in the arm and was going to be the primary witness against him. He was never charged with any crime and yet was allowed to then come testify against him a number of months later. And there were extremists in the courtroom threatening to kill our client, the judge, and the lawyers involved. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. And after 3 years in a cell that was incredibly small, got up to 40 degrees Celsius, his initial appeal was denied, and he was on final appeal to the Supreme Court of Pakistan. When we're doing this training for a group of lawyers who are going to take up cases, we ask them to think through what the legal arguments are on the person's behalf, what the leverage points are to apply pressure on the government, and what are the pros and cons of going public with his case. Let me cut to the chase and let you know what happened. We submitted a petition to the UN, and we, not surprisingly, won his case there. They found that there was an egregious lack of due process. This wasn't really a freedom of expression or religion case in reality, because he denied having ever said what he was accused of having said. Had he said, yes, proudly, I did say Christianity is correct, then that would have been a freedom of religion or a freedom of expression case. But actually, it was really an egregious due process case, and that's how the working group found. We corresponded privately with the Pakistani ambassador to Washington, who refused to do anything, and so we got a group of well-positioned U.S. senators, 9 of them on the Appropriations Committee, that gave out foreign aid money to Pakistan to privately reach out to the government of Pakistan and urge them to resolve the case. And we decided not to go public with the case at the time. General Musharraf was president of the country, and he was under pressure from extremists in his own country, and if he was seen as bowing to U.S. pressure, then that might have made him less able to react. And this is, literally the timing of the process and how it all played out. You see the UN opinion, the letter from the Senate. That then triggered 6 weeks later the Supreme Court to take up his case, and a 3-judge panel heard his case and issued a judgment very swiftly, mirroring the decision that we had gotten from the United Nations. And a week later, the United States Embassy helped get him to a safe house, and we worked with the embassy to get him to the United States. We met him at the airport right outside Washington, D.C., and he now speaks English fluently, was granted asylum, and has the rest of his life in front of him. So a happy end to a very tragic and tough story indeed. So that is everything that we do in a very brief period of time. I know it's a lot of material for everybody, and this was intended just to give you kind of a taste of our work and what we do and how we do what we do. And I know that some of you are law students or recent graduates, 1 or 2 lawyers in the room as well. But we're happy to answer questions that you might have, general or specific, and also obviously happy to give anyone our card if they have an interest in getting involved in what we do. So let me see if there are any questions or if we've rendered you all speechless given the time of night.
Well, I have many questions, but just to strict your questions, I just want to know what is more useful for you, if it's more useful to go to the UN or to get the US government help, or a bit of everything, or what is how do you decide, what do you do in each case, and what is the most efficient? Because I see that you work a lot with the US government, finally, for this case, the person could get an asylum, so I mean, you're a very high level, and that's great.
Yeah. Well, look, the crux of everything we do is really the UN mechanism, and the reason is because it allows you to say on behalf of your client, look, it's not just our opinion as lawyers or advocates that our client is being wrongly detained. An independent group at the UN has said that the person is wrongly detained, and in some cases that will allow the US, which might not have wanted to get involved, to be willing to get involved, or other governments around the world as well. As I said, we do tend to lean on the United States a lot because we're located in the US, and the US has leverage if it chooses to apply it. But I actually think this is something that can be replicated globally using the UN mechanism as the starting point, because when the UN says a person's being detained, that actually has a lot of credibility to then go around and get other support for what you're doing. I mean, it's a stamp of approval that you don't have if you're an advocate for somebody, whether retained by them or not. If you're trying to help a person get out of prison and you're just an average person on the street, if you have the UN saying they're held wrongly, then that will help you succeed. Because it puts the government on the defensive, because other governments will be more likely to be able to take up the case, because they don't have to go check out the facts. They can just, they'll rely on what the UN has said oftentimes. And it also can get you some media coverage and other people interested. What is this case about? Why should we care? And the UN opinions are usually pretty well written, short, and cover the salient facts and why the person is being unfairly treated. So I mean, in our case, yes, we rely a lot on the UN. It is very fact dependent in terms of how we approach cases, but using the UN mechanisms is a real key part of what we do. And we've worked with a lot of the special rapporteurs who have, raised cases privately to governments that and we're able to get that information and put that to use in our ongoing advocacy, and we're able to reflect to to other governments around the world or to regional bodies that we've been working with the UN, and here's what we're hearing. So it's also for gathering of information. It can be valuable. But I would say the UN is a key part of it. Absolutely.
And if you work with the US government, so I think that it's difficult for you to work on US cases.
Right. We actually
because there is, I guess, some cases in the
yeah,
US
of course.
I've heard about. So
yeah. Well, we as a matter of policy have, although we haven't excluded working on US cases, as a matter of policy as an organization, we haven't. And the reason is really because what we were trying to do is provide counsel to people who don't have it or can't get it or who can't afford it. And in the United States, there's a very robust pro bono tradition for lawyers to work on cases. And there are literally dozens of organizations working on all the aspects of the Guantanamo cases. Mm-hmm. And frankly, in a case like the United States, you really need to work the cases in the domestic legal system. And we're not litigators who are experts at the domestic U.S. legal system. We're international lawyers and international advocates who are experts at the international system. So even if we were to work on a Guantanamo case, for example, it wouldn't be the domestic legal process. It would be through the international process. But these are all cases, at least in our experience, that there are many people lining up to work on these cases, and we prefer, although Aung San Suu Kyi's case is an exception, we prefer to work in cases that nobody's heard of, where domestic lawyers are struggling under very tough circumstances and are afraid, in the case of Pakistan, their client's going to be executed, right? Or in the case of Vietnam, we represented a dissident who we got out of prison who had gotten a 13-year prison sentence after translating the What is Democracy webpage off of the U.S. Embassy website and giving it to some friends. So these are really egregious facts. I have no doubt that a number of the people in Guantanamo were innocent. A lot of them also were picked up on the battlefield and probably are terrorists too. And those are, frankly, outside of the people who would fall in that latter group would be outside of our mandate. As we work exclusively on prisoners of conscience as a class. There are a lot of arbitrarily detained people, which would be a broader category that would be in Guantanamo, but they're arbitrarily detained. They're not prisoners of conscience. And so, with that as an illustration, that's why we really haven't gotten into those cases. You're also right that probably wouldn't make us many friends in the U.S. government, but really it comes down to we want to put our resources with Aung San Suu Kyi's case is the one exception, right? We want to put our resources into cases that nobody's heard of, so that people will hear of them and will want to act into.
And who helps you financially, like right person, organizations, or it's on each case, or how do you?
We get foundation grants and individual contributions.
And the government, U.S.?
No, we don't take any money from the government. No.
Yeah, no government money, private foundations and individuals.
And I would add too, just about what we do and where we go. The U.S. in many cases is just strategic. One, as he said, we're in D.C. and we find a number of people in D.C. that care about these cases. But in a lot of cases too, it just makes sense. There's some leverage that the U.S. is able to bring to bear on these cases. But that's not always the case. And as far as in the European Parliament or in European governments, we'll partner with other organizations that are based there. So rather than us go there and try to lobby as outsiders or advocate rather as outsiders, we'll partner with organizations where that's their focus. and we do that on a number of our cases.
But I mean, one illustration is Cuba.
Cuba.
Right, where Cuba, the United States has no leverage at all.
So we do nothing.
We've
We
done
do
nothing
nothing with
in
the
the
U.S.
United
government.
States, right? We've worked with Spain, we've worked with Venezuela. We've tried to see where we can get leverage on the Cuba cases. But, you know, even though there are lots of members of Congress interested in Cuba,
Yeah.
you know, the worst thing that we could be doing for our clients is
It would
advocating
undermine,
in the
yeah.
United States government. So
It was great for our particular client, but we kind of all did a big sigh when it happened. Was he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bush a few years ago? Great for him, but the second we heard about it, we just sighed because we knew that took his case, you know, backwards, frankly. Yeah.
A follow-up question when I entered the room. What made you start this? This is very creative, very innovative, public relations stand, and then the real core, which is the legal rights and globalizing it, as what Mr. Professor Ewing Cosner
Right.
mentioned. Globalizing not only the internet but also legal rights. And so why this did not happen many years ago? Why only recently? What made you start this idea?
I mean, I actually just got involved in one case as a law student. I read about the case in the newspaper of a British guy, actually a white guy, who got himself arrested in Burma for handing out leaflets and had gotten a 17-year prison sentence. And I helped get him out and was there at the airport when he arrived after 416 days in solitary confinement. And I kind of tripped through the process of, you know, I took a petition to the UN and got the British government and the US government involved, and a couple of things came together at the right time. We won the case to the UN, and word came out that he'd been beaten up in his cell right at the same time, and that led to an international outcry. But then when it was all done, I was kind of like, well, that was great. I got a white guy out of a Burmese prison, you know, but, you know, wow, what about a Burmese person out of a Burmese prison and a Pakistani out of a Pakistani prison? And that's what persuaded me to get some friends together to create Freedom Now. And before creating the organization, I went around and met with a lot of human rights groups to see if there are others who are already doing it. I mean, there's no reason to create something that already exists. And what I found, unfortunately, and it's not to say anything negative about other groups, but other groups have their own agendas, and this wasn't it. You know, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, the two biggest, human rights players out there, right? You know, they do reporting on 100+ countries in the world. They don't intend to do individual advocacy. They might do pieces of what we do, but they don't actually represent people as clients. And when you're a volunteer, in my case, a volunteer lawyer with Amnesty, you know, you're given very clear guidelines about what you can and can't do, and you can't use the Amnesty name, and you can't go out and lobby on Capitol Hill using the Amnesty name, right? Like you can, do legal research in writing and send it in to a central place within Amnesty International, and that's how they want to use their volunteer lawyers as an illustration. And so that wasn't what I wanted to do. I just tripped through a process where, like, when I was a law student, I had the awkward experience of coming back after a semester in London, and like I was advocating on Capitol Hill for this guy who was in prison, and like I didn't have an organization, right? And I was a law student, and so like I'd be calling up offices of members of Congress and saying, yeah, this is Jared Genser calling for James Monsley, this guy in Burmese, and they're like, oh, who are you with, right? And I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say I'm a lawyer. Like, I don't have an NGO, so I can't say I'm with an NGO. Like, I'm with nobody, right? I'm just like a single advocate, right? And so, as you learn in kindergarten, at least in the United States, it's always good to have friends. So, I got some friends together so that we could actually have a platform to do this kind of work more systematically. And as I said, I mean, the reason why, it's not because it isn't compelling or important, but the reason why this just isn't done is, of course, we're not paid for the work we do. We do all this work for free. And so because there's no money to be made in this work, it's why, other NGOs haven't necessarily taken it up. As I said, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch or other big international NGOs aspire to, transform countries and report and, research and report. And they'll do a report on a trial of one particular prisoner, right? And we'll use that information in our advocacy, but they don't intend to single-handedly get that person out of prison, nor do they represent that person. And when they're doing a report on a trial, they may have issued 3 or 4 or 5 other reports on that country in the last year, right? And in some respects, and there's nothing wrong with this, but in some respects they're conflicted. They'll have problems going and talking to that government because they've been highly critical of them in a whole bunch of different ways. We won't take up a case of more than 1 or 2 people at a time in a given country because we want to be able to be exclusively focused on that person's detention. And so our goals are just different. And one isn't better or worse. I just happened to really enjoy what I did and found it really rewarding to get to know the people, who like the panel we had earlier today of the human rights defenders, to stand in solidarity with those people who are frankly putting their own lives in serious jeopardy and are taking huge risks to bring a small measure of freedom to their own countries. To be able to stand in solidarity with them is a huge privilege and honor, and to create space for them to do what they do is our small contribution to the globalization of human rights. So that's kind of the best answer I can give you. Other questions?
No, law students, no questions?
Former law students?
Former law
graduates?
students?
Sounds really interesting what you do and really relevant. I'm a member of Amnesty International, but I was a bit disappointed by this kind of, lack of real legal advocacy for these people. It's mostly PR and sending some letters and all. It's good, of course, but I was also interested in some real advocacy.
Well, and we work, I'll mention, we work with a lot of law students. We have law student interns over our summers, as well as actually non-law student interns. And we work with lots of lawyers, law students, and other advocates, people interested in working on these cases. The great thing about this is that it's about as tangible as it gets. I mean, it's one person's life. And we work directly with the families, which gives you a sense of connectedness that it's hard to get if you're going to work on, and as I do, the situation in North Korea. I mean, you get connectedness from meeting people like Shin Dong-suk, who told his story earlier today, and you can have that kind of connection. But if you're an advocate on North Korean human rights and humanitarian issues, and I do outside of Freedom Now, a lot of that kind of work, the rewards are very slow to come and are about connections with people like him on a kind of occasional basis. But it's quite different than having a responsibility for one person and taking on that responsibility and really trying to do everything humanly possible to get a person out of prison. As you mentioned, it is creative. It's one of the things I most enjoy about it, because we work now in probably close to 10. Well, we have 10 cases now, or 11 or 12 cases in 8 or 10 different countries, and so there's always a new country with a new set of political issues, a new set of human rights abuses. Obviously, the facts of every person's case are different. Where the points of leverage are different. Whether you want to go public or not is different. So there is. You're always, at least in my experience, you're always learning something new, which for me as a lawyer, I really enjoy. I enjoy knowing enough to be dangerous about a number of countries in the world. And I also really enjoy helping to support and collaborate with local NGOs and human rights lawyers who are fighting the good fight on the ground. Because we're blessed to be in Washington and to be able to do what we do from there or from here in Geneva. That doesn't make us the most brave of human rights activists, but I think we do have a small contribution that we can make. Although I will say I do go to lovely countries like Burma and other places, but again, I think they're going to be much less likely to pick up the white American human rights lawyer on an average situation than a domestic Burmese lawyer who is advocating for a prisoner of conscience. So, while technically maybe I could get myself into trouble in a place like Burma or Vietnam or some of the other places where we represent prisoners, most of the time I don't spend all that much time worried about it, because as of yet I have no reason to feel that I've ever been at risk traveling in China or Vietnam. Or
Yeah. Unlike many of the domestic lawyers we do work with, they are often harassed. And so one of the not only do we feel like we serve on behalf of the individual prisoner, we also feel like we're a lifeline for their lawyer as well, because we bring more international awareness to the case, and it oftentimes makes the local NGOs that we're working with and certainly the lawyer feel a little bit more protected, because there is a light being shown on them as well.
And they're also frankly we're able to say things because we're not in the country that they might want to say but would feel unsafe saying, right, in terms of talking about the lack of due process in a case or otherwise. And so that also deflects from the pressure that they're under domestically, which is sometimes very huge.
Just following those last remarks, you never had trouble getting visas for China or Vietnam?
So far, no. I've yet to have a visa denied, but it will happen, I'm sure, the next time I apply to Burma. When I went last time, their security apparatus had fallen apart after a former prime minister had been put under house arrest. So they were reconstructing their blacklist. I'm sure at this point I probably would get denied a visa to go to Burma. China, I actually never tried to go while I was representing a person. I tried going subsequent to that and had no problem. I mean, I had a period of time where I probably did a half dozen newspaper op-eds on China, bashing them on their human rights record. Maybe if I had applied at that time frame, I would have had a problem. But so far, no problems, but clearly lots of human rights advocates like myself are routinely denied visas to travel places. So I have no doubt it will happen, it's just a matter of when.
Yeah.
So going back to Madame Aung San Suu Kyi's case, how do you, if not to speculate, but any possibility to end this, just the longest?
I mean, unfortunately, I think it will probably end towards the end of this year. And I say unfortunately not because I'm not delighted she'll be out, but because they're going to proceed with their so-called elections without amending their constitution, which has fixed the result in advance, and without allowing her or the other 2,100 political prisoners to be released and to participate in any meaningful way in the transition from a military to civilian government. And so in that sense, I think their plan, according to them, is to release her at the end of this year. You know, that may or may not happen. There's going to be a lot of pressure between now and then on the junta to try to make it slightly more participatory. I don't have any expectation based on everything I've heard from the people who are talking to the regime, including the US government. I don't have any reason to believe that they're going to listen to the international community. They may ultimately let her out of house arrest, but it will be after the transition to a new government, and the new government will be firmly in control of the military. So it won't mean a fundamental change in the lives of the Burmese people, and in that sense, it will be incredibly sad, not only for her for having given up 15 out of 20 years under house arrest, but most importantly for her people, as she herself would say, because the human rights abuses are massive, systematic, and profound. You know, and those who are responsible for them are not going to be held accountable anytime in the near future. So it continues to be a major ongoing struggle.
Well, and while we're hopeful, certainly for her release, the trend has been, and we would of course be cautious for her rearrest, because she's of course, you know, spent a great number of years, you know, out of the last 20 years in prison. They have let her go for certain periods of time. I think 2 years, maybe 2 or 3 years was the longest she was out.
2000.
So to be honest, if they release her, you know, it's no assurance that, you know, she's got her freedom permanently. And in fact, the history has shown us that that's probably not the case. It would probably be more for PR showcase for them.